to present. We have Raewyn, Tudor and Shanee Barraclough. Hopefully I've said your names right there.
Shanee Barraclough.
Okay, so I will hand the floor to you. Okay.
Thank you. I'll just bring up our presentation. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great. Tēnā koe. We're really pleased to be here presenting our paper, Thinking Boxes, Behavioural Boys and the Politics of Love, doing post-qualitative inquiry and critical social work research. I'm Raewyn Tudor and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Social Work here in Christchurch at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand.
And kia ora, I'm Shanee Barraclough and I'm a senior lecturer in counsellor education in the School of Health Sciences, also at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand.
Okay, so post-humanism and feminist new materialism are a growing feature of social work scholarship. We argue these post-theories challenge taken for granted qualitative research approaches, and that also the critical vision, the critique of the unified, conscious and rational subject of humanism doesn't go far enough into making a difference and affirming that the world could be otherwise. Post-qualitative inquiry offers a compatible performative methodology to post-theory that enacts an ethico-onto epistemology approach to research, integrating theories of knowledge, ways of being and becoming with ethics. In this presentation, we take up this approach and offer a post-qualitative reanalysis of research data from an inquiry that I undertook into school social work practice in the aftermath of earthquakes in Canterbury, New Zealand.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the concept, Karen Berard's concept of diffraction, and talk about it in relation to concept and method and how we're taking that up in this presentation and in our research. So diffraction is described by Karen Berard as a concept from classical and quantum physics, reworked in her feminist new materialist performative framework as both concept and method. And in particular, it's offered as a counter to the optics of reflection and practices of reflexivity. As researchers, this entails a shift from seeing ourselves as reflective, reflexive, self-referential observers of the world towards researchers who come to understand the world from within and as part of it, whilst participating in its ongoing performance. And this is an ethical, affirmative and creative research practice. It requires accountability and responsibility for the cuts we make in our research practices and the knowledge that we produce and that we participate in producing. So originally used by Donna Haraway as a counter to reflection, she claimed that diffraction was a mapping of interference, not of differences, but of where the effects of difference occurs. Seen here in the image and as a diffractive wave pattern created by the sea hitting the rock. For Haraway, this was an ethico-political commitment to making a difference, to go beyond deconstruction and criticality toward reconfiguring and reworlding in the research stories that we tell. Berard's concept of diffraction, taking up as a research method, recognises both the research process and the objects and subjects of our research as dynamic relational processes, as entanglements of things. And these things, Anna Hickey Moody says, are constantly changing, exchanging, diffracting, blending, mutating, influencing, and working inseparably. And so our job as researchers who are co-implicated in the findings we produce is to engage in this often slow, difficult work of attending to these entanglements of matter and meaning, the material and the discursive, and of multiple times and spaces. And we do this in order to undo binaries, to reconfigure notions of identity as dispersed and dynamic rather than self-contained and fixed. And responsibly engage in the ongoing work of unsettling and reconfiguring what might yet be, what was, and what comes to matter in social work research and practice.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we returned to a particular piece of data from research which sought to gain insight into school social work practice following 2 major earthquakes in Canterbury, New Zealand. In the aftermath of the earthquakes, the provision of school social work was extended in earthquake-affected schools as a means to support children and their families considered high need, high risk, and high priority. Part of my research in this space, I analysed recovery policies and interviewed 12 school social workers, and all of those participants had been working in Christchurch schools following the earthquakes. The specific example that we present here is an account from one participant, Vivian, it's her pseudonym. And she was a school social worker working in a school situated in a low socioeconomic area. And she was running a therapeutic education program for a group of boys who'd been identified as misbehaving. And the aim of the group was for the boys to reflect on their own decision-making and manage their relationships with others. We selected this moment, this interaction between Vivian as Vivian recounts this interaction with this boy, referring to him as the little man. In selecting this moment, we took heed from McClure's advice to choose data that seems to glow, an example that has intensity that holds our attention. The moment we present is recounted by Vivian in a highly affectionate manner of the little man who's speaking of his brain functioning. She refers to as his mingle, his amygdala. And Vivian talks about how she responded to his talk of his brain in really an affectionate manner. And this was all taking place within the context of a chaotic group program space.
So engaging in this process of reanalysis with this moment that glowed for us, we talk about the material, what we call the material discursive knots that emerged. And so taking up diffraction as method enabled us to engage in an entangled process of reanalysis. We knew knowing emerged from reattending to a complex entanglement of all kinds of matter and meaning, including data, bodies, our own as researchers, and of the participants and of the boys that Vivian speaks of furniture, of discourse, of affects, and so on. Engaging in this reanalysis produced for us 3 knots of entanglement, or patterns of matter and meaning, which we sought to untangle and remake in order to see what more we might come to know about this moment of social work practice. With the first knot, labelled here as boys' agency in the mingle thinking box, we mapped the concepts of the mingle, or the amygdala, and thinking box to explore how they've become extracted from neuroscience and connected to other concepts to address the problem of boys' misbehaviour in post-earthquake schools. And Raewyn will speak to this knot in particular next. In the second knot, labelled the non-classroom as place of in/exclusion, we engaged with the materiality of the space, the room and furniture is entangled with the other boys in the encounter and their processes of becoming. Thinking with diffraction enables a focus not only on human agency, but on non-human objects and spaces and forces and their vibrancy and entanglements. Finally, with the third knot, we attended to Vivian's expression as a power relation produced in the research moment, when she says, "And I think I might have actually said to him, 'I love you,' or something." We explored the conditions of possibility love opened up as a process of becoming social worker. In the time that we have left in this presentation, we just attend to one knot, and Raewyn's going to speak to this now, the mingle thinking box.
Okay, so
that's just coming up to 5 minutes, just to let you know, 5 minutes there.
Thank you. Rethinking boys' agency with the mingle thinking box. The little man articulates knowledge of his emotions, which originate in his mingle, his amygdala, identifying how they are processed and managed through his thinking box. This understanding of brain functioning originates in neurobiological studies, which traditionally describe cognition and emotion as separate processes enacted in two different parts of the brain, the amygdala for emotions and the prefrontal cortex for cognition. What becomes clear when tracing this differentiation of human brain functioning is a binary with emotions facilitated by the amygdala at one pole and thinking led by the prefrontal cortex at the other. The latter form of functioning is privileged, constituting a Cartesian model of the rational thinking subject for all stimuli emanating from the material world through bodily taste, sight, touch, could always mislead the mind. This neurothinking has been brought into education spaces where children's misbehaviour is understood as impairments in self-regulation or the ability to control over one's thoughts, emotions and behaviours. For boys, this understanding is overlaid with constructions of masculine identity, which positions emotion as something that they repress or something that bursts out. These concerns were intensified following the earthquakes, where there was an overarching concern for children not being able to cope with the traumatic effects of the earthquakes, and a range of interventions and programs and services, including that which Vivian was facilitating, were introduced to enhance children's ability to manage their emotions and behaviours. Through Barrad's theorising, we're aware that these kinds of normalising practices are not manifest within the events of boys' emotions, bodies and brains, but are only evident through the practices of knowledge production. She emphasises what comes to matter is not completely settled. With this in mind, we return to neuroscience and find that the amygdala plays a more significant role in mediating the role of emotion with cognitive processes. Recent research evidence demonstrates the amygdala facilitates attention with emotion, particularly in situations where there are limited attentional resources. It has a broad role in initial perceptions in terms of emotional signals, but also with cues that are more complex. It perceives facial expressions, body language, and non-social stimuli, even those of inanimate objects. We find less basis in neuroscience for emotion as interference or a barrier to thinking than previously thought. A more nuanced, complex interactional model of the internal neuroprocesses emerges, giving credence to the notion of emotion as thinking. Adding emotion and the materialist function of the amygdala to the analysis enables us to reattend to the moment when the little man spoke up. There is chaos, just like this is not working, and Vivian is thinking, okay, this is not looking too good. The facial expressions and bodily cues from Vivian and the other social worker present may display their disappointment and apprehension. They had brought the boys to the room where they'd set up the furniture and gone to lengths to develop the program so that it was participatory. The boys were not attending to the learning, they were climbing over the furniture. Vivian kept struggling along, talking about managing our emotions. The little man has a memory of having learnt that in another school and says, what about your mingle? Vivian is aided in this moment by the little man when he says the right thing at the right time. Vivian experiences the little man as knowledgeable, saying, yes, and I actually think the mingle is a great way to describe it. The little man's agency is constituted within the material discursive dynamic of the encounter, such that the mingle produces an emotional learning response in himself, but also in Vivian, who responds to him differently. The little man becomes not someone to be managed, but someone to be learned from, a site of difference in becoming, a child as educator. We've highlighted attended to differentiated moments brings to the fore that which is otherwise excluded. In this case, the worldliness of the boy's knowledge practices and interaction with the nuanced power relations. Re-engaging with neurotheory stimulated different lines for being emotional, thinking, behavioural boys. Rereading agency through diffraction as concept and method assists to move beyond critique. And aligning with social work's social justice mission, diffraction offers new ways of encountering normativity, constituting alternate processes of becoming. Done.
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was really interesting. I had attempted to use Karen Barad in my own PhD as well, so it's fascinating to see how you've used her theory as well. I found her really challenging to read, to be honest. But that was brilliant.
Yeah. Always on the edge of competence.
I know. Okay, so we will have time for Q&A at the end, but I just want to pass over to our next speaker now, which is Heather Lynch. So Heather, the floor is now yours.
Okay, I'm just I think I'm audible. I don't know if I'm. Oh, I can't find my controls.
There you are.
Yeah, thanks. Gosh, I'm in my own mingle moment, so I'm going to I'm going to keep that with me. My sort of this arrangement of being in my house, listening to the birds singing and listening to you guys. It's the sort of perfect way of thinking about that sort of confusion and what it makes possible. So thank you so much for that. Okay, I shall go on because I know that Natalia, you're being a very, very efficient chair. I'm taking notes here, knowing that I'm not so good at letting folk chat on. I'm just going to share my screen with you. I've got some. Hopefully you can see what I can see. Can you see a slide that has an ancient tree root on it? Excellent, thanks very much. Okay, so just a bit, this paper is very, very much a work in progress and is based on conversations that Tina and I have been having around the intersection of our interests. So Tina coming from her sort of historical stance in social work and how it gets to be and how it gets to change, and my own work in continental philosophy and post-foundational thought. So in this paper, I'll raise some of the questions that we have come up with in looking at what's going on from our contexts of Scotland and Canada, chosen purely because they are the context that we know, the situations that we are familiar with. And what we've done here is we've been looking at two separate policies that have been revised over a similar time frame and presented to the social work constituencies in each different context within a couple of years of each other. So, and they both speak to social work education. So we're coming at this with many of the questions that Susan has raised around environment and its place within social work education. And sort of thinking more widely about some of the problems of that. So I've got some pictures that I'll show you as we move on, and I will read to you this script that covers some of the ideas. I should say within this kind of time frame, I'm going to pose some big questions that I don't have time to unpack, but hopefully in the conversation, if there's stuff that comes up that you say, oh, how can you say that? You haven't told us exactly where that comes from, then we can have that conversation then. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief overview of social work's relationship to environmental questions, and then I'll go on to look at these recently revised education standards in Canada and Scotland, and focusing on how these relate to environment and to some of the issues that they raise that we hope to go on to explore in more depth and as we develop this paper. Okay, so oh, just knocked my earphones out. That's not a good start. Okay, so some of the most significant questions of our era emanate from what many frame as environmental crisis, whose slow and not so slow unfolding human life has witnessed and been affected by, knowingly or otherwise, for generations. The reasons are complex and multiple: global temperature rises linked to excessive use of carbon, pollution of the sea, the soil and the air, deforestation and destruction of ecologies that had thrived for millennia, the depletion of underground water supplies, and humanity's toxic addiction to antimicrobials have created the conditions for numerous harms. The increase in extreme weather events, floods, droughts, hurricanes have had further devastating consequences. For example, Kelly and colleagues convinced that the Syrian drought of 2006-07 made a significant contribution to civil unrest, the war that followed, and the mass migration that followed from that. Species destruction has led to what Elizabeth Colbert calls the sixth great extinction, and of course the increasing frequency of zoonotic disease and the effects of which I don't have to detail here. These harms have an impact on all life, but the rate and level are unevenly distributed across geographies, species, and human demographics. This surely has relevance for social work, and yet the response from social work scholarship, policy, and practice has itself been slow and uneven. Social work, and here's something I'll open up that we can maybe discuss further, is a product of modernist thought that centres human relations, and as such has been preoccupied with what Robert Cassel has called the social question, a question of human inequalities and human relations. In this paper, we want to consider the challenges for social work in developing the environmental, or what might better be termed the biosocial question. In the paper, I'll look at some of the social work practice context of Scotland and Canada in order to ground some of these issues and summarise environmental concerns that perhaps should be relevant to social work in each place. Okay, so before I start on this, just a really brief overview of some of the specifics of environmental questions that could have relevance for these different contexts. So in Canada, environmental issues include the long-standing problem of lack of access to drinking water in more remote Indigenous communities. This problem links environment with colonial issues around the land, quotation marks, granted to Indigenous people, and the responsibility for infrastructure. It's been described as environmental racism. Another problem is the recent urban heatwave of 2020, and this led to excess deaths of economically disadvantaged people who couldn't afford air conditioning to deal with the temperature surges. So there's just some of the issues that social work might be interested in from a Canadian perspective. In Scotland, there are some differing but certainly aligned issues. So many areas face coastal erosion, and this threatens crofters living in island and coastal areas, as well as harbours and homes. Flooding is a threat across the Central Belt and will particularly impact in the most disadvantaged. The UK Climate Change Committee recently, in fact this month, just a couple of weeks ago, the assessment of risk indicates that rising temperatures and inadequate adaptation to housing will lead to excess human mortality in coming years. Air pollution, as a slide here of where I live, is a growing concern as accepted levels of pollution are now deemed harmful. So excessive use of insecticides and pesticides has led to growing numbers of bed bugs, rats and mice. These are issues which face everybody, but those with less money are much less able to move themselves out of these problems as they manifest just now. So, and just to say, environmental degradation is not just about climate change. We hear a lot about that, especially with COP coming up. Environment is multifaceted, multimodal, involving complex relations of matter, life forms, economics, culture, and of course politics. It's a mingle. I'm going to use that word a lot now. This demands multi and interdisciplinary responses, which Susan has already set out. These examples also make apparent the particular disadvantages of least affluent and also the ways in which underlying race and colonial concerns have relevance to the distribution of environmental problems in the now. So given social work's commitment to social justice and for protection of the vulnerable, you might think that it would lead the way in championing the need to understand and address these issues, to mitigate the harms and advocate for policy change at local, national and international levels. However, despite the best efforts of a small, and some of you guys are here and will be here across the day, growing group of social work scholars, this remains a niche field. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview at this point of what's going on with environment and social work before looking at the policies. So without doubt, some folks are making the case. Text by Lena Dominelli, Gray, Coates and Hetherington that Tom mentioned in terms of social work in the title there, have been influential and inspiring scholarship over the last decade. Heather Boeto's work alone and with colleagues gives insight into the infrastructure of the profession. Susan, who's here with us, details clear routes through which social work can contribute to the effort needed to address environmental challenges of different orders. In 2020, Clemmer and McNamara argued that social work's feminist and ecological perspective allows it to offer a distinct contribution. In 2018, Stark claimed that social work needs a more communal approach if it is to work not just in human relations, but also more than human relations. However, in 2018, an article by Mel Gray and John Coates, who has devoted over 20 years to social work scholarship and generating knowledge of environmental degradation, they bemoan just how slow social work scholarship has been to address these issues. And King et al.'s review of environmental literature and social work from 91 to 2015 sets out a map of unequal and limited action. Yes, they say the number of papers published over this period has increased, but actually only in line with the general increase in social work articles, not as a percentage overall. Moreover, they state that the majority of this work comes from India, China and the United States, and a fifth of this is tied to particular disasters that have taken place in these contexts. So disaster is a focus that indicates social work's enduring role as a crisis response mechanism, and less so in mitigating the conditions that lead to these disasters. And the problem with this, as Rob Nixon points out, is that environmental degradation is a slow violence, and that waiting until the situation is acute at crisis point is just too late. So notwithstanding all of the compelling...
Sorry, 5 minutes there. Oh, I know.
Make that 10, okay. Notwithstanding all of the compelling reasons that this should be of interest to social work scholars and practitioners, unlike many other disciplines across humanities and social science, social work scholarship struggles to build momentum. Okay, so I'll move on. So in this paper, what we're looking at here are two documents. So this one, this is the SISWay, this is the Standards in Social Work Education in Scotland. This is what social work higher education institutes have to teach to, and it was reviewed and published in 2019. So what I would say here is that there was a number of studies, I'm glossing here, Natalia, there was a number of studies done that inform this particular revisions of this document by various scholars in social work. And what they said is that this needs to change to address barriers to Black and minority ethnic social works, improve preparedness for working with mental distress, and address the gap between academic work and realities of practice. So these were the main issues that were discussed across the field of social work in Scotland that would inform this. And the standards were changed, but not significantly. And you can see, reading this slide yourself, like where some of those main changes were for the SWF. And the emphasis in the SWF is around skills development of assessing risk, managing intervention, advocating for those in need. And it's built on an overarching ethical code that promotes individual rights of expression and opposes oppressive discriminatory practice. So it's underpinned by Kantian ethics and the principles of human rights. And I'm going to gloss here as well. Much of the response to what's been going on in Scotland, the response from critical social work scholars has been to say that there's too much individualism and we need more community. We've swallowed the neoliberal doctrine, and social work is in hop to a state that delivers this neoliberal doctrine, and the social work needs to change to become much more focused on the collective, so much more focused on community, and that this is a loss. So what you could say there is that what you can see clearly is there is no mention of environment, like no mention of environment whatsoever. It's just simply not happening. That's not to say nothing is happening in Scotland. Scotland has a really strong tradition of community education, and much of the environmental work that happens in Scotland happens within community-based organisations. And this slide here is from a community organisation that I work with, Lamb Hill Stables, who are committed to working with people who are often and sometimes social work service users through environment, through space, through land, through soil, through water, through the canal. And just to say that in trying to raise the lack of interest in environment, I did contact our chief social work officer who sits with the Scottish Government, and I haven't got the written response here, but the response that I got from her was a redirection to SEPA saying, basically, if you're interested in environment, contact the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, because the lead social worker in Scotland has nothing to say about that. So that, in a nutshell, is the situation in Scotland. In Canada, things are different. Canada has its own standards revision, which was published in 2021. EPAS, which is a standard that HEIs work to in their development of curriculum. And there's no question that in Canada there has been something of an environmental turn. Section 9 of EPAS, which I've got here, sets out 9th of the 13 learning outcomes, and you can see that it's focused on environmental sustainability, so it has a clear space. However, what we would argue is that even this nod to centering environment is problematic, and it's problematic for a number of reasons. The proposition that social workers should understand the need to create ecologically sustainable communities, economies and natural built environments in which all life forms and ecosystems can survive and thrive is for us a problem. And I'll use an example from my research in multi-species homes to make this point. So my work in multi-species community included families living with bed bugs, mice and cockroaches. This gives insight into the ethics of multi-species living. The creatures themselves caused stress and rashes simply by living as they must. Human attempts to annihilate the creatures through all manner of means, from tweezers to burning, to chemicals, risked residual harms to the humans themselves. And ultimately, it's precipitated greater resilience in the creatures it intended to harm in the first place. So at best, people found an uneasy negotiation where humans live with some discomfort and some creatures die. So this is a very local problem that I looked at within Glasgow, but it can be replicated across different arenas. For example, shifting from non-carbon fuels impacts carbon-based jobs and livelihoods. The use of air conditioners mentioned before to save lives from Canadian heat waves will also make a significant contribution to carbon emissions that precipitate the higher temperatures in the first place. So ecosystems where all life forms thrive are impossible. And the challenge is how to negotiate a terrain where there is always harm. There's never not harm. There's no future where all ecosystems thrive because there's always harm, and we have to live with that. And navigating ethical tensions is standard fare for social workers engaged with people whose options involve settling for the least bad. However, when this deliberation includes more than human life, this question requires different ethical tools than those given to us by human rights Kantian frameworks that centre the human. And these are provided by an anthropocentric modernism that dominates social work. So these sorts of issues are present in EPAS. While it does its nod to environment, it doesn't acknowledge that these are issues that really have to be addressed. And it's alluded to in the other statements here and in the other points. So environmental justice is tethered to human inequalities linked with race and wealth disparities. Furthermore, it's premised on protection of human life as it parallels a plea to protect the marginalised and racialised, so no mention of more than human life. And Section D extols social work students to embrace policies that ensure ecological health and environmental sustainability at local, regional, national, global levels. And this statement assumes that such policies can and do exist. And as is evident from the debates and other contexts, environmental harms create different systemic pressures that need to be managed. This is very, very tricky ethical stuff. And so the observations of what's going on in Canada betray a gesture towards environment that is not engaged with the complexity of environmental problems in general, nor those that are specific to social work. And I should say, returning to Stark, she suggests that that the communal stance helps here, that a notion of community does help in terms of thinking environmentally. And given that within Canada, within this Canadian document, there is a lot of talk of the collective and there's a lot of interest in collective issues around Indigenous populations, French-speaking populations, issues of race. So there is an engagement with community and with the collective. And so perhaps there is a way in here that does lend itself to thinking about environment, and that perhaps the loss in Scotland of community is what makes it so incredibly difficult to think of how Scottish social work might engage with environment, while Canadian social work has done that. But still, I would suggest that thought of community rests on communitarian values, and if communitarianism is the other side of the liberal coin, it's the other side of the liberalism coin that still sits within that modernist tradition of Kantian ethics, and therefore it still centres the human. So that's what we see within this Canadian set of standards and why it's problematic. And it doesn't align, so it doesn't nod to any of the post-foundational thought that informs much environmental philosophy. So scholars such as Haraway, Bradotti, Van Duren, Wolf, and Ingold, quoted here, as I will conclude, because I can see Natalia glaring at me. So it doesn't engage with this type of complex ethical thinking. And at best, it offers a socio-cultural view of environment which persists in placing it as a backdrop to human activity, rather than an integral coming to presence of all life, human or otherwise. The Canadian EPAS gives a nod to more than human ecology, but the bulk and substance of the text is devoted to human groups and relations. And as such, it cleaves to modernist thought that privileges human life. So the challenge that we can perceive for social work is how to move away from modernist thinking. If social work is born from modernist thinking, if social work ethics and standards are built around the modernist thought and the Kantian principles, then how does it shift away from those? How does it find an alternative conceptual architecture that reconfigures the human? And that this for us is the challenge for social work, and that it's this fundamental shift in social work's orientation that will lead to modes of education and thinking and research that do cut through the sort of work that we do, and that are an add-on of the environment course or the environment book or whatever. So social work struggles to mitigate the impact of enduring human inequalities. So to ask it not to only take into account more than human equalities, but to displace the human from the centre seems further than it can reach. However, if it's to engage in this environmental debate, it's a challenge it just has to be prepared to negotiate. And there is some cognizance of that. I'll point to Vivian Bozalek and Bob Pease' volume in post-anthropocentric social work, some of us whom have written for it, to say that this is starting to happen. And what I would just say in conclusion is that this analysis, as you can see, is a work in progress, pulling out some questions of environment and how this relates to relations beyond the human. And that these are not just social but biosocial questions of community. And for social work, this challenges how community is conceived and how post-foundational formulations of community might allow greater focus on more than human relations. And that associated with this is the question of ethics and how to contemplate a more than human ethics that throws up troubling questions on the distribution of harm and the risk that any human engineering may inadvertently create additional harms. So there's no easy answers. These questions don't have answers. They don't have models. They don't have frameworks. So if we do this, this will produce that. But for us, it is about finding ways of posing these questions, finding ways of opening up these sort of neat policy frameworks and making them more problematic so that we can discuss this in the present and potentially pull different formulations into presence that generate more potential for environmental biosocial thought. Okay, so thank you for that whistle-stop tour, and apologies for overrunning, Natalia.
I think the word's glossing, Heather. The word's glossing. Thank you so much. That's, again, really fascinating presentation. I think lots of pertinent questions here are being raised for social work within all the contributions so far. Okay then, so to continue and just keep things on track with time, I would like to welcome our next speakers to the panel. I will let you introduce yourself. I think we've got Caroline McGregor and Pat Dolan, though I think Pat's not attending. Is that correct, Caroline?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, so I will let you continue now, Caroline. Okay, I'll give you 5 minutes warning as well.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation. Can I just check you can see my slides? Yeah, great. And apologies from my colleague Pat Dolan. I'm here to present on behalf of the two of us today, and absolutely delighted to be here. And thanks very much for the presentation so far. It's rarely I've learned so much by past 8 o'clock in the morning here in Galway, Ireland, and it's been wonderful. So thanks very much. And today, our interest is to speak with you around a framework in relation to support and protection that Pat and I have developed in relation to the recent book we've developed really as a guide, for sort of a practical guide for social work. And one of our questions, I suppose, is how can we make social work knowledge production and application based on partnership and collaboration, I suppose, our mainstream and dominant discourse. And when we're talking about knowledge in relation to social work today, particularly talking about the theories and approaches that we teach to our students and that we apply in practice. So where are we coming from? I suppose you know, some of the current challenges that we see for teaching social work in particular is that often, you know, in the present day and at various moments in the past, we talk about social work being in crisis, or Chris Maley recently talked about the end of social work, which has created some debate around what does that mean. We're talking today about the future of social work. And sometimes those conversations can be what my colleague Pat and Nick Foster call kind of doom-laden, drawing from power. And indeed, there are a lot of concerning and critical issues for us to consider. But sometimes that's a challenge in terms of thinking about the possibilities within the context of those challenges. And I also sort of, you know, I think it's important for us to sort of think beyond what Chris Wojcik called the gladiatorial, which I think is a great term to maybe describe sometimes the discussions or the debates we have between ourselves and within social work, either radical, traditional, or collective, individual, critical or non-critical, whatever that means in social work, and to encourage us, I suppose, to think beyond those sort of modern constructions of our social work themes and debates. And I'm here today to sort of say I'm struggling myself. You know, I have a challenge in my own work to find that reach beyond maybe modern constraints in terms of how we think about social work theory. A recent article, for example, I looked at the use of paradigms in social work and the material from the 1980s and 90s from sort of Burrell and Morgan and David Howe, organising theory and being applied to organising social work theory in terms of its purpose, whether it's to transform or reform, and in terms of orientation, in terms of whether it's individual or collective. And there's many more theories and approaches we could add to this revised paradigm framework that I developed. But still, the problem is it's sort of trapped within boxes and within the constraint of, I suppose, broadly academic theorization when it comes to the broad theoretical knowledge frameworks for social work. But there were this box in the middle, this constants, I think may bring us a little bit forward. So I want to suggest maybe from that paper, there's sort of two key arguments that maybe help to bring the discussion forward alongside others involved in this debate. And one, I suppose, is asking the question, are there some elements of social work that we could sort of sign off as accepted, that they are constants, whatever approach we're taking, whatever theory we're approaching. I talked about the box in the middle, that it's about social justice, human rights, person and environment, and so on. You know, can we get to a point where we say, well, we're all agreed that these are certain constants that define and feature social work in all of its breadth, and then we can get into sort of deep critique and debating about how we take social work forward. This balance in care and control is one of the examples I want to talk about today. And I suppose the other important argument that I feel from that paper is just emphasising again and reiterating, speaking to converted here from this audience, just about how crucial it is to embrace practice-informed theory generation and testing and critiquing in terms of building on the work in relation to practice-generated research, practice-informed theory, and sort of I would use particularly the work of colleagues in Norwegian countries in terms of practice research, for example, this text by Mark Benson and Philippine. But that's not enough. It's by far not enough. Thinking about another moment of change in social work, Mark Limbury talked about social work at the crossroads 20 years ago. And one of the statements that he made in his article, I suppose, resonates, I think, still very much for present day, is about arguing about the importance of breaking down the barriers between professionals and lay people who use services and who are involved in services. And this line, I think, really resonates for us in terms of practitioners to recognise that the trust of people we work with can't be earned, that it has to be earned, that it can't be assumed. and that obviously is pointing towards an approach around parity of participation, using Nancy Fraser's terminology, and leadership from those either directly experiencing and affected by social work or those practicing social work in terms of transforming social work knowledge production and application. I didn't introduce myself very well at the beginning, so I suppose just to contextualise, I'm Professor of Social Work at NUI Galway. Pat is also Professor at the University. And I guess one of the, while very committed to kind of practice partnership and so on, we're also very conscious of the power imbalances that continue to exist, particularly when it comes to knowledge generation and theory generation from the academic domain. So I guess we feel it's important that we ask the question, we're asking others to lead in terms of transforming where we develop our knowledge, what theory and approaches from, but what social work academic leadership has potential to offer. Given that we're starting broadly, there's generally, certainly within our context, but I think it's reflective for most global contexts in terms of an imbalance of power, in terms of the level of theorizing and knowledge formation that comes from within academic domains. And brilliant that we are much more strong in terms of practice generation of knowledge and practitioner partnerships, and to some extent co-production with those who experience services. But still, I think the knowledge from the academy dominates. Colby Peters talks about leadership for social work in the context of organisational, relational and individual factors. And I think that's a useful way to think about it. I think the social work academics in particular, those who are in that position, I think we have a real opportunity to use our positions within the university to really challenge and advance how knowledge is produced, not just within social work, but more widely, particularly in light of agendas around looking at the impact in society of knowledge and research, looking at how we can engage communities, but also emphasising the importance of the relational. Pat in particular draws from relational cultural theory and presence approach in that regard, and our own personal commitment to knowledge production and change. And this framework, which I'll just refer to today just for the time, is really a practice framework thinking about these sort of 5 concepts as sort of an overarching, what we call a scaffold of how you can kind of think about social work and think critically, whatever approach that you're taking. In terms of duality of support and protection, looking at life, post-life events and transitions, intergenerational relations, health and well-being, and civic engagement and partnership. Within a broad ecological frame, has already been discussed a lot today, or a system frame, whatever that is, and a critical perspective, thinking about rights and justice, intersectionality and super diversity. And thinking today is how can we achieve sort of this goal where doing an experience in social work automatically involves mediation and conversations about the knowledge that we bring to that, about the theories and the ideas or the approaches that actually inform how we intervene, how we decide to intervene, and that's in a partnership context. So I think there's a lot of developments that we've already had within social work, particularly in the last 20 years, which I think are a good starting point. The emphasis around social work as a profession which is about citizens and citizenship, and I think that concept of us all as global citizens automatically helps us to start to break down power relations, even in our heads, in terms of how we think about our position in the world, think about our position in the environment, of working towards that sort of citizenship, civic engagement, and that very much strongly reflected to political engagement. We have fantastic work to draw from in terms of the work in relation to citizen-engaged social work practice, for example, Peter Beresford's and colleagues' work, citizen-engaged education. We also have a lot of excellent efforts around rethinking social work theory. Just one example, in Mumford and O'Donoghue's kind of 4 principles kind of resonate with the framework we're promoting around relational practice, multi-level practice, operating in terms of promoting local and Indigenous knowledge and reflection on practice, and also developing sort of models of collaborative leadership. And again, here in the slides,
5 minutes there, examples. Caroline.
Thank
Just
you.
5 minutes. Okay,
Thank you, Natalia. Some examples of the range of work that's ongoing. So just to think of one sort of element from that framework in terms of duality of support and protection, Pat and I sort of talk about sort of critical art, which is really just connecting analysis, reflection and thinking. And when we think about it, one of the constants I have written about and talked about a lot in my work is accepting this sort of duality, that if we are to help define social work, that one of its defining features is mediation between care and control, support and protection, support regulation, within this broad kind of person and environment context. But we need to acknowledge this duality and communicate it to the public. I don't think we have enough conversations outside of the academy. We have a lot of critical thinking. We have a lot to think about in terms of theories around social, power relations, promoting subjectivity. I think in particular we need to mainstream theories around power and power relations in social work. We can learn a lot maybe from some of the early work around family group conferencing, where those kind of conversations developed. I also think we need to kind of develop more of an analysis and evidence that leads us to know that in reality, most support and protection happens within families and communities. Social work isn't involved with the majority of populations. The majority of our populations have worked out how to get this balance, primarily with their own informal and formal and local and community networks. So to reach out, what kind of knowledge ensures that? What knowledge do our citizens bring to their lives to balance support and protection where social work intervention is not actually needed? And I suppose we're talking about how we can articulate or express that duality in a way that sort of, I suppose, is more inclusive, and some steps towards facing the challenge. I think we need to, with all due respect to the fantastic work that's done within the theorising field of social work, the evidence is that it's obviously not enough, because it's not having the impact or the effect we would want it to have after so many years of building up this knowledge. So really committing, again, has been discussed around decolonisation and democratisation of knowledge. And we have to relinquish power of knowledge within academia in order to gain the power of knowledge that comes from citizens who experience or who practice social work or those within our communities. We have to learn and relearn a lot of skills around mediation and diplomacy. We're very much emphasising, that perspective that we start with the practice and experience drives theory and not the other way around. But we really need to fight for and advocate. This can't happen without significant resources to support the development of theory testing and review and development of practice with practitioners and with those who experience services. So I think we need sort of a number of integrated leadership actions, and just putting them out for us to consider in terms of our critical analysis and thinking about knowledge and academic positions and power relations, favouring and emphasising models that can help us to break down those power differences, like aspects of social and community development, but also partnering and presence, having more physical and intellectual presence with individuals, advocacy organisations, and really embracing the role of social work, as Nick Frost describes it, as a networked profession. And really pushing forward and prioritising those who are really working to have open communication, open publication, and non-jargonised, so that everybody can get in the debate. We stopped the broader closed shop. I'm not here saying that academia, I'm here supporting the position of academia that's not an obstacle, but we need to use it more as a vehicle for change, with an emphasis, as I said, in terms of engaging communities in a way that can really transform how we generate and how we share, how we use knowledge. So I had Laura Epstein, kind of a fantastic kind of theorist coming from Canadian, she was from a Canadian perspective. I just want to end with this quote. She was talking in 1996 about the need for, again, a big change in social work in terms of the need for excellent thought. And we need to develop a set of themes, develop a new set of themes to help us enter the new era in which repetition of the old themes no longer will do. I think we've come so far in terms of having new themes in social work, particularly in terms of the emphasis on co-production, civic engagement, and partnership, both, as I say, with those who practice and those who experience or who have social work intervention. So, but it's about mainstreaming it and making it the dominant discourse, as opposed to what I think it is at the moment is lots of pockets of good practice, but still not the dominant, or still predominantly the modernist kind of theoretical knowledge discourse in social work. So thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to discussion later also. That's a final slide that you can just read. I'm just conscious of the time, that Pat and I are sort of, I suppose, emphasising not just being critical but collaborative focusing on action as well as analysis, on rights as well as reflection, and on talking as well as thinking. And so sorry. Thanks very much. Over to you, Natalia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was really, really interesting. Okay, so just keeping in mind the time, and we have a final speaker next. So we have Karen Bell. Hi, Karen.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi there.
Okay, nice to meet you. I'll let you introduce yourself, and then you can just begin whenever you're ready, okay?
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Look, thank you so much to everyone that's come before me this afternoon. I've learnt so much and I've really enjoyed all the presentations. My name is Karen Bell. I'm an Associate Professor of Social Work at Charles University in a place called Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, Australia. And before I start today, I'll just move my slides along. I'd like to acknowledge that I am located on unceded First Nations lands. I'd like to pay respect to elders, past, present and future, and in particular the Wiradjuri people. And I'd also like to pay respect to Australian Indigenous and other First Nations colleagues who are present today. In this presentation, I've just been enjoying hearing all the discussions so far, and I want to outline a transformative philosophy of social work as a foundation for that reimagined future or futures of social work beyond the Anthropocene. I'll present a rationale for those post-conventional approaches to social work philosophy, as well as a case for transformation beyond the destructive legacies of the modernist lineage of social work. And as other presenters have said, it's a really complex area, so it will be a light touch on some very complex issues. I'll summarise some of the key aspects of a transformed social work ontology, axiology, epistemology and methodology. And I'll highlight some of the careful mapping that needs to happen as we as a discipline, as a profession, move towards a transformed future. And the importance of having that a compass to guide us on that journey, and of centralising relational ethics as one of the elements of that guiding compass, or those guiding reference points. And to finish off, I'll raise some broader implications, considerations and possibilities, as well as challenges for social work in the 21st century, and some hopefully exciting possibilities for further exploration. So my positionality is coming from a dominant Euro-Western social work tradition, you know, in how I was educated as a social worker and how I think I'm probably still immersed in lots of ways, but really interested in having an affirmative, hopeful and creative stance to move social work as a discipline beyond that dominant form of Euro-Western social work. And as it's grown out of those modernist and divisive metaphysics of modernism, and to really focus on how those divisive metaphysics intersect and interact and reinforce those systems of oppression. And I'll speak more about that in a moment. And I think it's important to consider the philosophical layers of social work as a profession. We often focus on action, and that's really important too, but I think we need to have that holistic perspective on our discipline and to foreground equity, respect and care, and to ensure that our conceptual framework really is responsive to those core values and ethics that our discipline espouses. So again, just touching lightly on some really complex areas. In terms of a rationale then for doing something different in social work to move beyond those divisive metaphysics and the hierarchical dualisms that come with the divisive metaphysics of modernism, whereby there's that mind-body split, the Cartesian mind-body split, male, female, culture, nature, human, non-human, etc. Those hierarchical dualisms and the problems that brings with it for our discipline, if we are truly about equity, etc. I'll also build on that idea about those intersecting systems of oppression, and I guess some of the key systems that intersect and continue to impress are patriarch, capitalism, colonialism, etc., and how they are intertwined and mutually reinforcing of one another. And I'm largely drawing on critical post-humanism and I guess two key issues that emerge out of a critical post-humanist frame to consider how we transform dominant forms of Euro-Western social work. And I think some of the two challenges, two key challenges there are around the humanist aspect that situates the male, usually white, heterosexual and economically privileged male as the normative basis for framing the subject and also for agency. And the other key challenge there emerging out of critical post-humanities is human exceptionalism. So seeing humans as masters of the universe and nature as there for humans to plunder and dominate, and how competition really feeds into that human exceptionalist frame. And that illusion of controllability. And again, many presenters today have touched on these themes as well. So a transformed philosophy of social work then really moves away from an ontology or worldviews that situate the individual subject as the standard sort of subject. It moves away from an epistemology or knowledge that's disembodied, and it moves towards that lived experience and hearing marginalised voices, that sort of knowledge production. In terms of methodology, so ways of doing social work, and whether that's practice or research, it really moves us towards hearing a wider range, a more diverse range of knowledge from a more diverse range of legitimate knowers and bearers of knowledge. And at an axiological knowledge in terms of values, it's really positioning that relational ethics. It's a positive stance, an affirmative stance, and something that has the capacity to really conceptualize interrelationships. So just a little bit more on each of those now. In terms of, a lot of this again comes from the critical post-humanist field as well as feminist materialism. And it's all about working to unpick the legacies and those damaging legacies of our modernist roots in social work. So there's lots of ideas and names floating around from some fantastic theorists around ontological transformations that position subjectivity as fluid, as nomadic, and as intersubjectivity. And I think that that's a really critical part of any sort of post-conventional or transformative philosophy of social work, because it then has the capacity to value diversity and interconnectedness and interdependentness. In terms of epistemology, again, working towards epistemic justice for a diverse range of legitimate knowers, looking at contextualized knowledges. And again, a lot of presenters have mentioned, localized knowledge and that sort of thing as well. That's part of a transformed and transformational sort of epistemology of social work, where we work with marginalized voices and we also seek out marginalized voices. In terms of methodology, again, a lot of people have touched on this around social work methodology being necessarily dialogic, co-constructed, participatory, creative and multi-method, and capable of framing interdisciplinary collaboration as well. And then that centralising in terms of the axiology of transformational social work philosophy, centering a love ethic, and affirmative ethics and relational ethics in that axiological frame. So how do we actually engage in this sort of transformation. And again, this is not a neat recipe for doing that. It's really kind of raising some ideas that you know, can be for further consideration. How do we transcend those persistent ghosts, as some others have called it? So Hussein and Bazalek call them the persistent ghosts and the destructive legacies. I really like that phraseology. So to take the sort of transformative thinking to some sort of level of action in social work, we really do need to consciously reimagine social work as that critical post-humanist discipline and centralise that deconstruction of those two major challenges around humanism and anthropocentrism. If we're going to make what Braidotti calls a qualitative leap to become a supra-discipline with that relational epistemic core. And Braidotti's not, in her writing, I really appreciate how Rosie Braidotti writes about critical post-humanism, and she writes about the doing of that, which I think is really positive. And she doesn't mention social work, but every time I read her work, I think social work is so ideal for what she's talking about. I think we're well positioned to take on a lot of these ideas really consciously and frame our work.
That's 5 minutes there, Karen.
Thank you. In terms of resistance, I think it's really about, again, consciously resisting those dominant narratives of control, competition, and environmental degradation, and those narratives that situate and construct inequalities as well. So remaining alive to those sorts of critiques. We also need creative visionaries, radical imagination and innovative practices rather than that game over cynicism. And as a previous presenter mentioned, the recent discussions through the British Journal of Social Work about, the end of social work. Is it the end of social work? No, it's not the end of social work. I think that we can engage in some really interesting ideas there around the possibilities for social work futures. If we continue that questioning the awareness of our conceptual framework and the possibilities for different futures as well. And I really like the idea of diffraction as well. And in essence, having principled action to move towards a transformed future for social work. So in terms of creative transdisciplinary practice, as I said, I really think social work is well positioned to engage with critical post-humanities. And again, going back to what Braidotti, or how Braidotti writes about the doing of critical post-humanities, she talks about the transdisciplinary or supra-disciplinary practices or practitioners as being capable of working between and within pockets of resistance and in those zones between organisations, universities and groups and industry and so forth. And again, she doesn't talk about social work, but I think that's what social workers do. We're really good at that. We're really good at making connections. We're good at mobilising others. And I think that, again, we should have a really conscious focus on how we conceptualise what we're good at, how we amplify what we're good at, to move to that transformational and transformative future. We can highlight our skills in interdisciplinary practice and knowledge and keep working on our own body of knowledge that reflects our skills, our competence in working in these creative ways with a range of professionals and in a range of ways with marginalised groups and communities and individuals. But we need to do it carefully. So we do need some reference points, a compass, to map our journey. And as I said earlier, I think relational ethics is a really key element of that, the compass or the reference points that we would use for that journey. And the practices of care and attention, and those ideas around growth for the future or sustaining the present and growing and nurturing the future. And there's some really interesting ideas around in the critical post-humanities about composting ideas. And composting, I think, is a really nice image because to have good compost. You don't just throw any old thing in the compost. You've got to think about it carefully. Some things don't compost well together. You've got to think about what's congruent with what you're creating. So that practice of care and attention and careful composting to nurture our future. And of critical importance, we really need to, again, coming from that dominant Euro-Western stance, we really need to be respectful of ancient and ongoing Indigenous knowledges. We've much to learn, and we need to be open to that and careful and respectful in how we might learn from colleagues with a whole range of really important knowledge that's been less than respected in the modernist frame and in colonial traditions. So it does matter what we think, what we write, and what we do. So some challenges, as I said on the previous slide, it's really around not being neo-colonialist in our transformational journey, but to being open and respectful in engaging with ancient and ongoing Indigenous knowledges. It's also about picking up the pace a bit, as people have mentioned as well in previous presentations. There's some change here, but the pace is a little slow, perhaps, in terms of education, in terms of standards for practice and that sort of thing. And I think it's critical, actually, to unmask patriarchy as one of the central pillars in that complex maze of intersecting and mutually enforcing systems of oppression. So heading towards the end of this presentation, so some possibilities. I think there's some really exciting work around the love ethic and positioning that in social work. And I love Naomi Godden's phrase there, to make social work a magnificent movement for social justice. I think that's really a lovely phrase. And also she writes about centralising that love ethic as giving a lot of power to being able to deconstruct violence and resist violence as somehow normal in human existence. And environmental violence as well could be included there for sure. So social work moving to be that qualitative, creative, supradiscipline, we're capable of nurturing what we've learnt from that soil of injustice, as Fine says. We work with many marginalised individuals, groups and communities, and again, that idea of diffraction is really powerful here. And as Haraway says, social workers really, well, she doesn't say social workers, but I'm saying social workers using Haraway need to show up, stay with the trouble. It's muddy business, it's difficult, but we need to stay with it. Be persistent, principled voices for justice. And every positive difference we make is valuable. And there I will end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. I think, to be honest, I think that was a fantastic presentation to end the first block on. It felt some of the language that you utilised and draw from there felt really, really positive, especially at the end. I really particularly like the stay with the trouble, the show up and stay with the trouble.
Yeah.
That really kind of sums up social work practice. But I also like the language earlier on that you that when you talked about persistent ghosts and damaging legacies. That really resonated for me with my work in immigration. You know, when we talk about when we work with marginalised communities, I think there was a lot that I could really draw from in my work there that I thought was fantastic. Really, again, I think that was a fantastic presentation to end this first block on, really. A lot of optimism within that. Thank you, Karen.
Pleasure.
So, as I said before, we've got some time for some Q&A. If you did want to put a Q&A in the chat or raise your hand, that's fine. Just aware of time, so I'm wondering, Susan, if you want to come in as the block respondent now, just to offer some of your thoughts in regards to the presentations, just while I'm waiting for some questions to come in the chat boxes.
Sure. Boy, I am sitting here with just a whole lot of different things percolating, but I have found myself looking and listening across the presentations, thinking about all of the different needles that collectively you and we are trying to thread here. And so I just would like to put on the table a number of 3 or 4 sort of terms really that I'm puzzling over or pondering, some of them which have been touched on. One is hybridity. Some of the ways that we seem to be struggling with modernity in particular doesn't leave a great deal of room, and I completely understand it and align with it, in fact. But for, I'm going to borrow your term, Karen, for trading zones. For sort of thinking about, there are going to be residues, there are going to be trace elements. We're not going to suddenly shift from one thing to another. And there's both the familiar, but there are also things that we're talking about that perhaps are not going to connect depending on who we're with. So I guess I'm putting yet another question on the table, but where would hybridity sit in this? Is it possible? Is it even something to think about? In addition to trading zones, I think contact zones is another critical idea. And we've talked about dialogue, and we've talked about engagement and conversations and listening and talking. I appreciated that, Caroline, that we have to talk. We have to talk, but we also have to listen deeply and kind of get out of the way as well as staying engaged. So how do we stay in that zone? How do we stay in those difficult spaces and not, how do we take up Haraway's challenge really to stay in the game? Where does translation come in? We're using some very abstract frames that themselves come out of some Indigenous, particularly the relationality frames and the cosmological frames, but many of the others come out of still European legacies and Western/European legacies of abstraction and cognition and paradigms. And so where's the translational space, both from the top down and from the bottom up, since there's a lot of relational, embodied, local, saturated, sort of lived experiences that come into play when we start looking, for example, I was just peeking while I was listening at colleagues at the University of Washington out of the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute have just co-edited a special issue on environmental justice and Indigenous knowledge systems. Not necessarily focused on social work, but it's clear that there would have to be translation between a Braidotti and those frameworks, for example. And then I just think, how do we think really about relationality, given, how do we decenter the Western human and still stay human? How do we think about warm eyes, warm heart, warm breath? Thinking of the hongi and the breath in the Indigenous Māori context, for example. It's a human to human encounter in the deepest sense. So we have some really, really productive spaces here. I think I'm incredibly stimulated by this conversation and just want to thank people for letting me put even more things on the table.
Thank you, Susan. I think yeah, that definitely brings together all the kind of conversations we've been having this morning. Some really difficult things to kind of tease through in regards to social work and where we're at and how we might envisage things in the future. I just wonder, has anyone got any questions for any of our speakers, or any thoughts that they would like to share before we finish in this first block? I think actually I have a question from Heather here.
Yeah, don't want to speak again, but I'll just keep the flow while other people join in. I was thinking of like some of the hybrid spaces that already exist in terms of One Health and One Welfare, where people are negotiating disciplinary boundaries and trying to deal with more than human problems. And I'm subconscious of the stuff that I've been involved with. I've been the only sort of social work presence, and thinking maybe there's something there, but also beyond that, there is something that Tom mentioned earlier that I am super conscious of, is this, on the one hand, there's this real desire to define and defend social work as a territory, but on the other hand, this hybrid work involves acknowledging that social work isn't one thing, it's lots and lots and lots of things that are happening in very, very different ways in different contexts, and that how do we work with that when there is a real pull within the discipline and the profession to defend its ground. But maybe these sorts of movements are helpful. I don't know, I found them so.
Okay. Are there any more questions there or any more thoughts? I think it's a lot to take in for the first block. Okay, I think, yeah, Tom, have you got your hand up there? Hi, Tom.
Hi, yes.
Hi.
Sorry, I'll try and get my hand down now before I forget. I apologize, I had to step out and do the school run, so I've missed some of the papers, so I'm going to chase people up for that. But it was really just to in a sense back up what Heather was saying. I think there's an interesting opportunity at the moment, and I think it's an opportunity for a lot of disciplines, but in particular the challenges that social work is facing in one sense, thinking about hybridity and these sort of shared spaces and that sort of stuff. Not to sound sort of nihilistic, but there is a sense in which this is, we've had these conversations before. We had them in the late 80s in lit theory. We had them in the 90s when Rosie Braidotti was kind of on the rise and writing nomad subjects and all that kind of stuff. And there's a certain allure sometimes of the phrases and the kind of not quite novelty, but there's it's like we want something different, we want to move into a different space, and obviously this is to support what Heather was saying. One of the first things that happens though, if you talk about hybrid spaces with a profession that might feel itself under threat, is that it starts to just redefine itself, but in quite a boundaried way. And you see this in a lot of disciplines. For example, when they started to close philosophy departments down in the UK, the first thing philosophy did was stop talking to any other subjects and mark out that this was what it did that was distinctive from everyone else, which is why you couldn't close it down. So, I mean, I don't have answers to this, but I think the two things to be aware of is, one, how that shift to a shared space negotiates the pressure of, the quite mundane but very real pressure of, well, are they just going to, if a role wants to move into a sort of space of hybridity, how does that get presented as not losing something, losing a core identity, and also the sense that how does that move, as we come out of COVID, as we come out, or as we've been in this sort of horrific austerity in the global north, how do we ensure that it's not just a repetition of the late 80s and 90s, where it sort of fizzled out and became quite a niche academic exercise rather than actual changes in practice? And I'm not saying there were no changes in practice, by the way. I don't want the ire of people who know far more about this than me.
Okay, thanks for that, Tom. I see a few more questions there. Walter, have you got a question there?
Well, just to follow on from what has been said, particularly by Tom, whilst being highly stimulated by the intellectual connections that are being made by these presentations, I'm just thinking of the working reality of the majority of social workers and the enormous pressure they're under, whilst we acknowledge that complexity is our business, helping practitioners, I mean, not step by step, but in their reality, to make sense and to apply what we in academia can think out. I think this is our real challenge, and I think that really requires our involvement in continuous training of practitioners, demanding not just higher qualifications, staying at university for 5 years instead of 3 years doesn't do anything, but recalling students after a period when they have been exhausted and burnt out by the pressures, to help them with these concepts to make sense situation by situation. I think that's the real challenge for the future. And we mustn't widen the gap between us academics and abandon the people who are controlled with regulations, with target setting, with budgetary constraints, and then with COVID and all the restrictions that that has imposed. So let's not forget about that. That's my plea.
Yeah, definitely really important point there. And yeah, I think like a lot of issues have really been raised this morning. A lot of it's a great way to kick off the conference. Just to